I'm really excited to be here. And I know that it seems weird to be super excited to talk about conflict resolution, but this is really my favorite topic. I'm going to just prepare my slide deck really quick and pull that up. But feel free to ask questions and use the chat. Greg's monitoring the chat for me. But I am hopeful that I can kind of just plug along and maybe have some time left over. So if you do have questions, there will be time for those, as well as if you'd like to talk to me directly about any situation that you're dealing with. I'm happy to be available to anyone as you're kind of working on difficult situations in your workplaces. So I am really, really excited to be here. I really love working at BYU. I do have 3 degrees from the University of Utah, so it's been an interesting journey for sure. Kind of getting to, wait, I might have just messed up my slide deck. 1 second, guys. Getting here to BYU, I can tell you I never thought I would be working here. That's probably when I first started thinking about jobs after I graduated from the U. You know, I didn't really think about working at BYU because in my world, you know, that was the rival. So I've been here now for about, including my teaching time, just over 5 years, and I love it. And it's been a really interesting and wonderful experience. And the students are just a pleasure to get to interact with, and I love the environment and the culture. So can someone give me a thumbs up? Can you see this screen? I don't know if I can see you, just see if I can get a thumbs up.
We can see it.
Is it coming through?
Yes.
Okay. So today our topic is conflict resolution. I'm going to talk a lot about communication and also languages of appreciation and trust, some of those kinds of key concepts, because, you know, when we're talking about conflict resolution, a lot of times people really want specific tools, even like I would say scripts that they can use in certain situations to resolve things. And over the past kind of 20 plus years that I've been working in this field, what I've learned is there aren't magical words. There is not really just the perfect script. There are words that can be very powerful and very impactful, but it really depends primarily on how you're doing as far as the health of your relationship and your culture and your structure to make those words actually have the intended meaning and impact that you're hoping for. So in other words, you can say something exactly the same way with the best of intentions, but if you have a very broken relationship between you and your direct report or your supervisor or your coworker, it really doesn't matter how well intended your words are or even how good your words are per se. There's a lot of sort of underlying foundational concerns that will kind of put a filter on the way that those words are perceived. And so we just need to think about it a little bit more broadly instead of just saying, what are the words, or, you know, how do I say this exactly? My suggestion is, it's kind of the, if you build it, it will come sort of philosophy. But the idea is, if you build a culture that's thriving and you have inclusion and belonging and authenticity and transparency, and then you lead with humility and true care and appreciation, you can even give pretty constructive feedback to someone. And because they know that that comes from a place of trust and sincerity, generally speaking, that can be a pretty simple conversation. And you don't necessarily have to have the perfect words, because that person will kind of grant you the sort of the, I don't know if the word gift is the right way, but kind of grant you that sort of belief that you mean that in the right way. And so we'll kind of get into these things a little bit more as we go on. I'm going to see if my video can work. And since we're here at BYU, I found one of my favorite videos in its Studio C. So let me just double check to make sure that I'm sharing my sound. And then Marie, if you can let me know if you can hear this, that would be fantastic.
Affectionate nickname for husband asking a question?
Distracted affirmative answer.
Question about whether or not you completed a mundane task.
Distracted affirmative answer.
Okay, I'm just going to pause to make sure you guys can hear this, right?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Sometimes I feel like Zoom and sound is always kind of a thing that sometimes can be pretty hard. All right, I'm going to start the video again. Thanks.
Answer.
Sigh. Follow-up question about a small detail of the task to prove that you actually completed the task.
Sudden realization of what you are talking about. Quick excuse about the small detail to hide that I was both not paying attention and did not do what you wanted.
Accusing response.
Defensive answer.
Listing the times you behaved this way before.
Weak excuse.
Explanation of all I do for you in a 24-hour period.
Explanation of all I do for you in a 24-hour period. Pausing moment where I realize I don't actually do that much.
Escalating tone as I state my disbelief that you did not complete the simple task from earlier.
Raising my voice as I repeat my lame excuse for not doing it.
Telling you not to raise your voice while raising mine as well. Calling for maternal parent.
Ignoring my female offspring and explaining how nagging you always are.
Equally ignoring her as I gasp in disbelief. Yelling for paternal parent.
Continuing to ignore her and bringing up the fight from the summer of 2002 where it was decided that you were actually the one to blame. Smugly inquiring if you recall said event.
Reluctant acknowledgement.
Sports reference, confirmation of points received.
Frustrated grunt followed by a statement about your brain capacity.
Accidental agreement.
Parental guardians.
Frustrated and questioning response.
Asking for permission to do something you've already responded negatively to. Exasperated repetition of daughter's name. Focusing my pleading on my paternal parent and changing my physical appearance to remind him of when I was a little girl.
Starting to side with my daughter.
Negative response, restating my disapproval from earlier. Statement about how differently I will treat my own children someday that will never actually be realized. Disbelief that you would take her side of the argument over mine. Statement of finality explaining I will not continue this discourse.
Indifferent response.
Beginning my brisk and dramatic exit.
Request to stop exiting. Question about dinner?
Okay, hopefully everyone enjoyed that clip, and I'd love to hear just very briefly a couple of reactions to that Studio C clip, if you don't mind just sharing quickly. Thoughts?
So very funny.
It's funny. And why does it resonate? And, you know, they're not even really, they're not actually, there's no actual content. It's just, you know, that they're describing what they would be saying, right? Or how they would be saying it.
Yeah, I like how it shows that we get into these patterns as soon as conflict arises.
Absolutely, McKenna. It's actually, there's a theory all about this, and it was developed by a great professor, Edna Rogers, and she studied relational communication patterns. And one of the things that she did is she looked at cultures where she and her research partner at Stanford, they looked for patterns of communication without knowing the language. And then they had translators actually give the insights on what was actually said. And they could tell without knowing the language how the conversation was going, as far as were there areas of opposition, were there areas of repair, were there areas of, you know, kind of all based on those nonverbal communication, but also just on these patterns, this human behavior that we often get kind of stuck in, and we get in these patterns. And a lot of it, if you really think about it, is so much because we're using emotion and we're reacting. And rather than using sort of logic and reasoning to say, is this really, like mindfulness, is this really the way I want this conversation to go? Is this making sense? You know, one of the parts I like about that clip is where he's like, you know, you just see like, he's like, wait. And then she turns around quite hopeful that this will be a repair moment in the conversation, in the relationship. And then he asks about dinner. And that's like, oh man, you know, that's like what probably one of the worst things he could have chosen to do in his all the many choices that he had in that moment. Any thoughts or reactions? Observations? Yep. And if you don't, that's okay, we can keep going. Yeah, but I like that video because mostly it shows these kind of interesting patterns of human behavior. All right, let's look if I can move this now on. at this continuum. So what we have here is a continuum that was developed by Patrick Lencioni, and he's a great scholar, especially on team dynamics. And just, I think he has a book that and a model that's pretty well known called the five dysfunctions of a team. And I really like his work. And what he shows us in this continuum is one thing that I think is really important for us to all realize is there are different kinds of conflict. I think oftentimes we just kind of work with the premise that conflict is bad, or that, that conflict and contention, these are synonymous things, and they aren't. Conflict can be very constructive, but it can also be very destructive. And so what's interesting, we have this continuum where I love the idea though of artificial harmony and mean-spirited personal attacks. And so what's interesting is sometimes we oh, Dixie. I don't think we have a comment there. Okay, I think we try to avoid conflict kind of at all cost. And so what we do to kind of make up for that difference is we decide the best strategy is just to have everything be harmonious. So if someone disagrees with me, rather than exploring that, I'll just sort of back away from it, and I'll just sort of say, it might be in my head, I agree to disagree, and then I won't continue the conversation. And oftentimes in relationships and in work cultures, et cetera, I'll see, because I've done, as Marie kind of pointed out, that had a lot of really interesting opportunities in my consulting work. I've seen a lot of different kinds of organizational cultures, whether it be within the legal system. I've worked with courts, or I've worked in hospitals, I've worked in manufacturing offices, I've worked in grocery stores, like just with all sorts of different kinds of really, really interesting leaders. And one of the things that you kind of pick up on is, is this a culture where there are mean-spirited personal attacks on kind of an extreme? Or is this a culture where everybody's just pretending that everything's just hunky-dory and we're all going about our business, but there's a lot of underlying active opposition? What do you think it means? Or maybe help me describe in the words that you could think of what that would look like. So in other words, we're actively working against each other, we're opposing each other, but we're operating with this sort of understanding of artificial harmony in our everyday interaction and also our workplace. Any thoughts on what that would feel like to kind of be in that situation? I'll keep going. So one of the things that it feels like is very, very superficial. And it feels like we're avoiding the real problems. We're not resolving anything. We're not coming to terms on things. We're just basically almost like pretending everything's okay when we've got some real things that we need to be working on. So what we need to do is just look at, okay, structurally, relationally, what are the things that we need to repair so that we can have this constructive conversation about things that we might disagree about, and that safe space literally is available to people to have those kinds of conversations. Artificial harmony is a different kind of conflict. It is not real peace. It's absolutely this sort of version of conflict. You've probably seen it in marriages. I remember, thinking maybe in the olden days, generationally, I think a lot of people would say, well, it's best to just basically act like everything's great, and just kind of not deal with stuff. And I think that a relationship based on that can be okay, but it is definitely not as meaningful or as productive as if you actually have authentic care and you can have like those conversations and have the ability to talk through things. I had a friend that said, in 20 years, my husband and I have never had one single fight. And I said, oh, I think her reaction that she expected from me would have been like, wow, that's really interesting, or good for you. And I said to my friend, oh, and is that okay? And she goes, what do you mean? And I said, well, do you feel like you can bring up things and that it can be okay to discuss things where you don't agree, or that it's difficult conversation, or you can, and she's like, no, not really. And I'm like, okay, why not? And she goes, because I don't want to break the streak. We haven't had a fight in our entire marriage, and I don't want to break that streak. And I said, well, is there things you'd like to talk about? And she's like, actually, really, there is one main thing. My husband never puts away his contact case when he takes out his contacts at night. And it really, really bothers me. And I just thought, why are you limiting yourself to actually being able to just provide that feedback and move on. And partially, one of the questions I would ask is, does he even know that this is bothering you? Is that even a problem? Is that a deal breaker kind of a thing to tell someone? It shouldn't be. So that was kind of an interesting example that I've reflected on, a real strong example of artificial harmony and protecting that artificial harmony, but that does come at a cost. So the impact of conflict. Shifting to sources of conflict. Now, this is really interesting because when we think about where does conflict come from? A lot of, I think, people think it's personality differences, or it's just how people are. I just don't get along with that person. And so we're just gonna, we're not gonna be able to have a good relationship. But oftentimes it's not really that, it's more of these kinds of key things that are the drivers of sources of conflict. So if you're competing for resources, there's a lot of places where you have a very short sort of staffing situation, and a lot of people are sort of competing or fighting for workers on projects or whatever it may be. And that causes a lot of tension and conflict, especially when people start feeling like, well, they're stepping on toes, or they're doing things where they're really feeling like there's competition for those resources. That can create an environment where collaboration becomes almost impossible, because collaboration is the sharing of resources. And when you're in a situation where there's a real lack of resources, it's just almost natural that that becomes a competitive situation for those resources, and you end up with a lot of tension. Now, if you guys can work things out to have, let's game plan this. Let's have this conversation. We have these amount of resources. Let's talk about strategically what we can do to deploy our resources in a way that will be most meaningful for our organization and for our customers, or whatever industry you're in, how that would be applicable. Then you can work through that tension, you would work through that conflict. Some people talk about storming kind of in the group dynamics model. You can work through those dynamics, and you can get to a place where you're like, okay, it might be a little tight. We're still stretching, but we have a good mutual understanding between, the people who need these resources of how we can make this work together. That is a good example of how conflict can be constructive, and you can actually strengthen your relationship if you just focus on you have to remind yourself that oftentimes that that we are a team. When you have areas where people start really siloing and they start saying things like, that they're not on my team, they lose that team mentality, they're another, things break down really quickly, and you end up having a lot of problems. Oh, it looks like Miriam raised her hand. Do you have a question, Miriam, or a comment?
Yes, I'm looking at these sources of conflict,
And
I'm wondering where, when someone just doesn't like you, where does it get in here?
That's a really good question. And so, it's one of those things, it's a little bit like you come to that conclusion with a bit of a fixed mindset, right? So instead of looking at, that person just doesn't like me and there's really nothing I could do about it, the better way to approach that situation is there's got to be something happening with this relationship where we've come to this point where they don't like me or I don't like them. And oftentimes it'll fit in one of these buckets. So it may be because you're competing for resources. It may be because you guys have very different communication styles and you can't figure out a way to make the communication work. There's a lot of misunderstandings. There may be a lot of passive aggressive or manipulative communication or those kinds of things, just indirect communication instead of healthy direct communication. You may have differences in opinion. Those might be things that are even outside of the workplace. For example, we've been dealing a lot with differences of opinions about some of the things that have been happening with the pandemic in our workplace here. Like to mask or not to mask, socially distancing. Are we really, are we doing our jobs to follow those guidelines? And there's a lot of differences in opinion. And then competing objectives, what I need is more important than what you need. And therefore there's this level of kind of like superiority in your approach of, your stuff is great, but my stuff is more important because there's an objective here that's competing. So I guess, Miriam, the answer is it could be all of these things. I don't know, I guess this could all become together one, like you could have all these things happening at the same time. More likely it's one or two of them that are really driving this problem between you and the other person, where it kind of translates into, they just don't like me. So hopefully that's helpful. But as we we'll talk a little bit more as we go on about communication strategies, bridging differences, and how to, anytime that you can shift from competing objectives, if you're on the same team, to collaborative objectives, you're going to have some good, healthy resolution. And, you know, again, turning that tension into productivity and resolution will strengthen your team. If you find yourself to be just a really competitive person in nature, that's just fine. And the healthy competition can really drive some results, but just kind of keep in mind that a competitive edge or competitiveness comes sometimes at a relational cost. So it's because competitors are generally those that say my way or the highway, or I'm right, you're wrong. My way is better. And maybe it is, but it's really, really important in using your good emotional intelligence, kind of step back from that and say, okay, let me think about how I can kind of put this competitive nature to work to build collaboration and to strengthen my team, rather than feel like I just want to win at all costs. Because I've worked with leaders who essentially tell me, you know, like I'm the only one that can do this, or my team, it doesn't help me at all. So I end up working all the hours and, you know, or, you know, and I want to say, you know, I can see where you're coming from. However, you're only sort of impeding your own success. If you can sort of change your mindset and realize that when your synergy is a really, really powerful thing. And if you can sort of harness the power of synergy in your team, and if you can really inspire your team and you work through the conflict in a very healthy way, you're only going to be more powerful. And as a leader, you have to figure out how to do that. Because if you're just basically saying, I don't really need them because they just make my work harder or more work for me, or they don't do it the right way, take a step back from that. Sort of, I would suggest kind of check yourself and say, that's not leadership. Like you kind of have to give yourself that feedback. That's not leadership. That's me just sort of utilizing them as objects for me to get kind of done what I need to have done. And you're going to be a lot more powerful if you actually use your team in an effective way and show that strengthen leadership, develop people, work with people, resolve the conflicts, talk about hard things, and move to that synergy and that synergistic flow. I love Stephen Covey so much. I'm just going to stop there. I'm just kidding. I just love Stephen Covey so much. And this is a quote from him that says, "We see the world not as it is, but as we are." Just trying to think about that for a sec. Or as we are conditioned to see it. When we open our mouths to describe what we see, we in effect describe ourselves, our perceptions, and our paradigms. So when we think about that in the sense of conflict, we have to really remember, and it's again using really good emotional intelligence, that we think that we're right and we think that we know and we're super convinced about our position, but we're really only seeing the world through the lens, which is we've been in the way that we've been conditioned to see it. And when we think that we know, and we don't ask questions, we don't lead with curiosity, we don't, question our assumptions, we're really, really doing a disservice to ourselves, because we're sort of turning off the ability for others to really give strong and helpful input on things. We're turning off their ability to even want to speak up, because we're assuming things before we even ask good questions about things. So I love the idea of just questioning and thinking through our perceptual biases and our certainties about what we think we know. And this is obviously an iceberg, but I really love the visual, because oftentimes we operate under the operating assumptions based on what we can see at that top layer, sort of above the water. And we think that that's all that's going on with someone, or that's all that's going on in the situation, because it's all we can see. And to just kind of put this into an example, if someone comes into the workplace and they're just not working hard and they seem distracted and they seem like they're almost like aloof, it's sometimes an easy thing for us, especially if it's day after day, it's easy for us to say, they're a low performer. They don't like the job. They're not motivated. What we kind of need to remember is this bottom part of this iceberg, because oftentimes if you just take some time to sit with them and you figure out what's going on with them, and maybe it is that they don't like the job, or maybe it is that they're, not motivated by the work because the project isn't interesting. But oftentimes it's more to do with a whole lot of other things that are happening in their lives. And as much as we can say, yeah, it's easy to turn that off and just focus on the work, we're all human, and we really know that's a pretty big ask to do oftentimes, especially if you have sort of a traumatizing sort of event in your life, or you're facing some things that are just really, really hard. It's really hard to not just sort of bring some of that energy into the workplace. And as leaders, if we can really strive to be empathetic. And interestingly, I had a friend at UVU that was an amazing scholar. And he and I talked a lot about, he was a researcher on empathy. We talked a lot about what is empathy really? And I've always been really fascinated by the idea of humility, empathy, and the transformative effect of those things in leadership. What is empathy really? And he had a really good kind of working definition that he was using in his research. And essentially he said, empathy isn't really, I don't think it's really like trying to walk in someone's shoes, because just kind of what we learned from Stephen Covey, we already are so conditioned that how do you even really do that? You know, it's like we can kind of try to do that, but we're really never going to understand and be able to experience their experiences in a way that would be really meaningful to understand. You could try, right? But the better way for him, in the way that he sort of outlined empathy, and I thought this was a wonderful thing, was he said, instead of thinking about empathy that way, let's think about it this way. Empathy is the desire, and he used the word righteous struggle to connect with someone, and struggle in the way of real struggle to want to do it. And so again, just to really kind of think about, if I come into a conversation with empathy, what I'm not trying to do is just say, okay, what would they feel like? I come into a conversation on their level, I sit with them and I say, how are you? Is everything okay? Tell me what's going on. Is there something I can do? Is the work going well? That moment can be incredibly impactful for developing employees, and just showing that care that can translate into a really engaged and loyal employee. Because in their moments when they need grace and we extend that to them and they feel it authentically, then those employees will stop worrying so much about the little things that are, you know, bothersome about work, even things that are like job satisfaction related hygiene factors, like compensation and those kinds of things. Because all of a sudden they have this experience out the workplace with this leader who showed authentic care for them and is looking out for them and wants to help them. And that, when we talk about people don't leave organization, they leave managers, they also stay for managers and organizations, because those kinds of contexts and those kinds of cultures are so meaningful to people. And we also want to make sure we're taking care of our employees is when we're talking about hygiene factors as well, as best as we can. So hygiene factors, if you know that theory, it's just those baseline job satisfaction factors that we really need, like safety and pay and safe working conditions to be able to even do our jobs. We want to make sure we get those baselines covered as best as we possibly can. But if you really want an engaged workforce, and if you want to be a transformative leader, take the time, make the effort, and lead with humility and extend empathy and grace. And you'll find that the impact is really, really powerful, and it's worth it. All right.
Marcy?
Yeah, Greg.
We had just a quick question to see if you could repeat the definition of empathy one more time.
So it's the desire and the righteous struggle to connect. And I have my friend Paul has a fantastic TED Talk that I would be totally willing to share about his experiences researching empathy. So I'll send that out, maybe even just through Marie in the wellness email. I'm trying to remember what it was called, but it was a fantastic TED Talk at UVU. All right, reactions to conflict. It's interesting because one of the things that often feels like when we're facing conflict situation is that we really don't have control. And oftentimes we sort of get into that mode of this happened upon me, so therefore my reaction is what it is. And if you obviously have strong emotional intelligence, and you've probably taken classes like this before and thought about this, you know that you do have more power than maybe you think, and really don't give up your power. Remember that you can make a choice. It's interesting in the research, and we'll get into some of this research, but John Gottman's a really great relationship scholar. And I use a lot of his thinking and kind of apply it to the workplace. But John Gottman talks a lot. He's the 4 horsemen of the relationship apocalypse. We'll talk about that in a minute. But he talks a lot about the repair bid. And I think that that is one of the most fascinating concepts, because one of the things that will define the health of your relationship is not necessarily the conflict, the amount of conflict, or even the kind of conflict. It's what happens when someone bids to repair the relationship. So to put that into some more, tangible terms, if we have a very big disagreement, let's keep it in the workplace, about how we want to process something. And I'm thinking about in my world, HR terms, maybe we want to make a change to one of our policies or procedures related to the way that we do background checks or something like that. And maybe one of my employees and I really disagree on the approach, to the point where we have enough tension that we almost need to kind of step away and compose ourselves. This is not a real example at all, but what's critical to what happens next and the success of the relationship and the team and the way that that's resolved is when that one of the 2 parties comes to the other person and says something like, I just want to apologize. I did not approach that the right way. Can we talk about that again? First of all, that's awesome for that employee to do. But what's critical is what the person that's being approached does next. And if the person decides to hold on to their anger and even kind of use it to punish the other person and say, nope, I'm kind of over that, you blew it. I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to think about that. Maybe that person is actually just needing more time, but there's a lot healthier way to say that. Thank you so much for coming to me and expressing that. I still need a little bit more time to think about that, but I would like to talk to you about it maybe tomorrow or the next day, because I do want to come to a resolution. That is key. The response is key to that repair bid. So we can have all sorts of kinds of reactions to these conflict situations, whether it's anger, whether it's withdrawal, whether it's kind of hiding, whether it's depression, where it's like, what, kind of that reaction, like surprise. And that's okay. That's our emotional response. Being obviously, I don't know how okay it is if you're yelling at someone, kind of like this picture of this man, but what I'm trying to say is that as a human being, that emotional response is natural. But we do need to be very, very, very mindful of what's appropriate in the workplace, and also the damage that those emotional responses can do to other people. And we need to use our emotional intelligence to kind of have that mindfulness to say, okay, I know that that's an emotional response. I don't necessarily want to react in a way that's going to be damaging to this relationship. So I'm going to sort of re-engage the frontal cortex and do what I can to think through what are my best options here. And in the conflict research, we call that going to the balcony. So kind of stepping out of what's happening on the stage, looking at it from a new angle, re-engaging the reason and the logical part of your thinking, and then making a better choice. And we can talk about a little bit more on that in just a minute. This is a story of when I was a leadership consultant and I was working with, a lot of people get sent to coaching, which is, I always love it when people choose to go to coaching. Like I want to improve my skills as a leader. I had one that he was a football player here at BYU. His name was Kellen. I can't remember his last name. I think he was a pretty good running back. Does that sound right, everybody? Maybe a few years ago. I think his first name was Kellen. I can't remember his last name, but I was working with him, and he was a manager at 1-800-CONTACTS. That was one of our clients, and he was incredible. And he came to us asking for just optimizing his leadership and wanted coaching. That's a wonderful way to do it. And it was a pleasure working with him. Well, interestingly, most cases aren't like that. In this case, with this angry email, was not a situation like that. It's where the leadership said to these 2 women, you guys need to get into coaching or something's got to give. So the woman was sharing a story with me and she said, this coworker of mine, we just don't get along. Like we're just, there's just no way. We're just like oil and water. And I don't know what to do. I've tried everything. I need help. And she goes, but she started to tell me this story about this email. She said, but things have gotten recently slightly better, and I'll tell you why. She said, I was going on a plane trip, and this was before there was Wi-Fi in airplanes. And I received an email before, I had to turn off my computer and everything from this employee. And it just triggered me. I was so angry. I was furious. And, she's like, I always find it to be therapeutic to just write out all my feelings on like the email I would like to send. And she goes, of course I knew, don't send that email. That's crazy, but she's like, it's just so therapeutic to write it. She goes, and then it was time to close my laptop and I had about a 5-hour flight. Well, you guys might be able to guess what happened, but somehow inadvertently that email got sent. And then she turned off and she let this woman have it. And then she turned off her computer for 5 hours. And so who knows, like this woman, she had no idea she's on this flight. She's just, kind of going on her way. And that who knows what's happening on the other end of this whole situation with this other person. But in the meantime, if she is sending her emails like, excuse me, or what is this? It's silence that she's receiving back. So that's just aggravating the situation. Well, she said when she landed and she opened up her laptop, she saw the email had been sent. And she read the response from the woman who had read it. She was, her first thing was like, oh my gosh, how do I take this back? How do I, delete this? I hope she hasn't read it, but 5 hours or 4.5 hours or whatever it was like, that's pretty unlikely this person hasn't read it by now. But she said that she was like, I was absolutely just so worried, so stressed. And I clicked on her email response to me and she said, the woman said to her, this doesn't sound like you. Do we have things we need to talk about? Can we meet when you get back from your trip? Which is a very nice way to handle that situation. And the woman that I was talking to said, we did actually sit down and have the conversation and things are starting to get better, but we still need we have a long way to go and we still need a lot of help. And I would love to keep working on this with you. And I share this story not to say, send these emails and everything it'll lead to good resolution. Do not do that. But the idea of if you have things that you really should talk about and that are kind of getting to you, don't just hold on to that. Have the conversation and approach it the way the woman did, saying, this doesn't sound like you, or, obviously that doesn't work in every context, but something to that effect where it's just like, can we talk about this? Because I would like to make things better. Again, that's the repair bid. And then remember, whatever you do next is going to have a huge impact on what happens with the relationship. And so when you have those moments and you're still holding on to anger, or if your ego is telling you, don't give into that, or don't agree to that, or don't apologize, just try to kind of go to the balcony and say, what do I really want here? Do I really want to be right? Do I really want to hurt this person? I mean, I might be completely right. And I might want to emotionally harm them. I don't want to physically harm them, but in that moment, because I'm feeling that emotion. But then ask yourself, what do I actually want? So what I want in the moment is always generally, at least going to be different than what I actually want. And what you'll most often actually want is a healthy relationship and a peaceful working environment. And so in those moments when you're thinking about what I actually want, you need to make a choice that puts the work to doing that, reaching that bigger goal or that bigger purpose, instead of just saying, what I actually want is just to sort of insult this person and kind of have my moment where I'm gloating, where I feel like I was right and they were wrong. And that feels really good. Well, it does feel really good for a few seconds. And then it's very, very damaging. And then things feel really bad. All right. So you've probably seen this before, the conflict modes. I like this assessment. It's Thomas Kilmann. You maybe even have taken this. And I won't spend a lot of time because I don't have a ton of time today on this, but I think if you've never seen it before, one of the things that you can do is take an assessment and find out what your primary and secondary conflict modes are. And the thing that I actually like to teach about this is, that's a really, really good thing to know, because those are going to kind of tell you what your defaults are. Are you generally someone who avoids conflict? If you are, that's something that you can maybe develop to be more of a collaborator. Like, it's good to know what your baseline is and kind of what your secondary is that you kind of default to. But what I have taught to leaders and what I have tried to do myself is actually see all of these as potential tools in my toolkit. And you might say, well, when would avoidance be a positive, or when would competition be a positive? hopefully you can think through times, and that would be the case, that these things can be very good tools to use. You know, again, healthy competition can be fine. It just depends on what your outcome is that you're trying to sort of get to. And for example, if you're, you know, if you're like we're doing March Madness right now in HR, and that competition is great for culture building. Bring it on, you know. So competition isn't always necessarily a bad thing, and some even tension within competition that can be there can lead to good productivity and outcome, as long as you continue to focus on making sure you're not damaging the relationships as you go. So again, all of these are really, really good tools in your toolkit. And the more emotional intelligence you develop, what you can do is you can read a situation, and you can, again, sort of turn off that sort of amygdala and the emotional response reaction, and you can re-engage your thinking and your reason. And you can say, you know, in this moment, my feeling is that I want to say something in a competitive way, but I think it would be better to sort of go for a collaborative solution. And one of the ways that I always facilitate conversations where we are looking for collaboration is really just say to the people, what do you need? And then to the next person over here, what do you think about what they need? You know, it's like requests. And if someone's like, I can't live with that. Okay, going back to the other person. Okay, so she's or he is saying that won't work. Is there another idea that we could look at? You know, and the productivity is really, really important. And you can get to a resolution if you can realize that there's other ways you can do it. But you have to be able to engage that thinking. Because if you're just reacting, you are really limiting yourself as a leader, as a coworker, and just as an individual in general. So anything that you can do to kind of think about these as tools in your toolkit. You know, collaboration isn't really actually working. I think I might shift a little bit to accommodation. Or you know what, maybe we should avoid this for a little bit and come back to it. Now, stonewalling is not the same thing as avoiding. And stonewalling is one of the 4 horsemen of the relationship apocalypse. And what that means is that whole like ghosting someone or the talk to the hand type of thing. It's a power move, and it's very, very damaging. Okay, so here's just a few basic conflict resolution best practices. And I've kind of gone through these a little bit indirectly, but what I would suggest is as much as you can do, manage the anger or the emotional response and try to engage that mindfulness and that emotional intelligence and think about strategically, not just what do I want in the moment, but what do I want overall? And do what you can to go there instead of just react. Go to the balcony, we've talked about a little bit. I really love this concept. It was developed by the Harvard Negotiation Project. And I think that it's something that you can really think of as you're in these conversations, sort of in the heat of the battle. You can think about what do I strategically need to think about or see here? Because I'm so in it that we're death spiraling, like we're going just down a really bad direction. Let me step out of that. And you have to do this all sort of in your head, or you can say it out loud. Because that's called just meta communication. You can say, let's talk about what's happening with our communication. Can we I guess you could say, can we go to the balcony and look at this like a little bit differently and see what we're trying to accomplish? And maybe there's a better way to communicate. I'm always a fan of that meta communication. So listen actively. I feel like that's on every list of every communication recommendation ever. But it's so important. And in our clip from Studio C, I really actually love that first part where he's like, acknowledge that I didn't hear what she said, you know, like not acknowledge, but make up a lame excuse and pretend that I actually heard what she said, but I didn't. We are such poor listeners so often. And our smartwatches and our phones and our laptops and all of our distractions, even like when we're at dinner with someone and there's like a sports thing on the TV and you see someone kind of going like this during the conversation. That's because humans really do. We're so distractible and we don't do well at listening. But if you really want to connect with someone, we go back to that empathy. If you're going to righteously connect, which righteously is being used in the word like real effort, connect, you need to stop thinking about what you're wanting to think about and you just need to start paying attention. And what's so magical about that is you can improve your relationships within the workplace significantly if you do the work to listen well, period. And then as you're listening well, you need to really, really be careful to think about your assumptions and to be aware of the fact that you're probably making assumptions that are wrong and you're jumping to conclusions. You need to try to avoid those. And that can come through clarifying potential misunderstandings or asking good questions. For example, let me see. I think I actually wrote one down that I think is really good. I'm confused. Can you help me better understand? Or I'm not sure I'm following this. Let me think. This is what I'm hearing. Is that right or wrong? So those check-ins, right? Those can really help. Another suggestion is to find something to agree on which to agree. And that can be really, really helpful in getting to that sort of integrative or that collaborative solution where you're like, okay, well, we don't agree on these items, so what could we agree on? Or how could we go forward? In mediation, the professional mediation world, you know, the goal of mediation is just to come to an actual resolution where in an agreement where you can both feel like you can go forward with this agreement in place. And you don't even need a professional mediator to help you to do that. You can start to do that in your own communication where you can just say, okay, what can we actually agree on here and how can we go forward? That can be a very productive way to do it. Be cautious with criticism. If you're starting to feel like, you know, you want to kind of go there as far as criticism or painful, sort of harmful type communication, that's a place to really take a break and think through that emotional reaction, because most of the time it's not based in what you actually want to achieve, but it's that feeling of what do I want right now, which is to hurt that person. And that damage is hard to sort of fix in the long run or take back. And then finally, be humble and movable. Humility is incredibly powerful. When I was teaching at the Marriott School, we would actually read that famous, I think it was President Benson's talk on pride and talk about the power of humility in the workplace. And I had my students do what I called the humility project. And it was interesting because I said, I really want you to be mindful of humility for the next 2 weeks and try to challenge yourself to be way more humble than you usually are. And I wanted to be like, especially for you Marriott School students, especially in the MAG program that are really, really pretty fond of your accomplishments and, you know, the fact that you're here at the Marriott School, it's really impressive. Let's maybe dial that down just a little bit, turn that off a little bit, and let me just challenge you to just really lead with humility in the next couple of weeks. And in order to do that, what I want you to do is I want you to take that talk, that humility talk, and I want you to read a passage from it. It doesn't have to be in order. It could just be a line. It's kind of like when you read the scriptures and you read like just a few words here and there. Similarly, just read from that talk, Beware of Pride, and try to apply what you learned during that day. And then I want you to take to your notebook at the end of the evening or your journal, and I want you to think of at least one thing that you learned. And I want you to do that for 2 weeks. And then I want you to submit a paper about how you believe that the things that you learned could be valuable for you in leadership and in the workplace in the future. After when I put together that assignment and after using it for a while, it was definitely by far the most feedback that I ever received was on the power of that assignment, because it changed people and it changed their point of view. And I put be humble with movable because you can't really be movable if you're not humble. And by being movable, you have options. I'm running out of time, so I might just kind of give you just a few final thoughts. I did want to talk to you about these 4 horsemen. This is absolutely so important, and it will really heighten your emotional intelligence if you think about this during your communication in your conflict resolution. So when you are looking at or thinking about or being mindful or going to the balcony during your conversation, just realizing that criticism, which is verbal attacks, personally on their personality rather, or their character, that is absolutely going to break down your relationship. Contempt is the same way. So attacking sense of self with an intent to insult or abuse. Defensiveness, similarly, damaging, victimizing yourself to ward off a perceived attack and reversing the blame. And then stonewalling, we talked about a little bit earlier, withdrawing to avoid conflict and convey disapproval, distance, and separation. I always find in the research that I've done that when these things are there, especially if they're always there in the relationship, you're in this sort of framework of active opposition. You have a sense of foundation that relationship is built upon that is very unhealthy. And contempt also includes a sense of superiority. And so when you have, if you've ever been in a relationship where you're feeling always criticized, or you feel like someone just thinks they're better than you, and there's really nothing you can do, or someone is just hyper defensive every time you say, hey, do you know what, could you help me? It would be really great if you could put your contacts away at night, your case away at night, and someone just jumps on that with defensiveness. That makes it very, very difficult to have conflict resolution and very difficult to have a healthy relationship. And it's difficult to be in that situation. And then stonewalling is very, very damaging. Interestingly, stonewalling impacts women, meaning it's more impactful in a negative way when we are stonewalled than men. That's what the research shows. In other words, when a woman, this is really interesting, stonewalls or silent treatment, gives silent treatment to a man, oftentimes men have an easier way, not a totally easy way, but an easier way of sort of compartmentalizing that and be like, okay, well, hopefully she'll get over that soon, or he, if he's being stolen by a man. But the women have, like, we really, really hold on to that, and we take it very, very, very personally and struggle with that. And that's why we want to like talk. It's like, no, please talk to me. Because for women, that stonewalling is very, very painful. Again, these are general findings about how genders respond in with these kinds of approaches, but I think they're pretty interesting. So on the other side, we have the antidotes. So for criticism, gentle startup, talk about your feelings using the I. You guys know a lot about I statements and I feel sort of statements, and express a positive need. And then build a culture of appreciation. Remind yourself of your partner's positive qualities and find gratitude for positive actions. I think that this whole entire idea of building a culture of appreciation is incredibly, incredibly important. And I have maybe just to tease a little bit of a teaser. I have finished, and we're just editing another article for the wellness newsletter about 5 languages of appreciation in the workplace. So that's going to be coming out. I don't know exactly, Marie, when my next article will be coming out, but there will be a lot more detail in that article about what are the actual 5 languages of appreciation for our employees. And just to give you kind of a little bit of a maybe teaser, a little bit more of a teaser, they're similar to you've heard of the book, the 5 like love languages, but obviously this is in the workplace, so it's got a different approach. But those things are words of affirmation and quality time, as well as acts of service, tangible gifts, and appropriate kinds of touch in the workplace. So what that would look like are things like fist bumps or high fives or those kinds of things, where some people really, really, really respond to those kinds of things specifically. And it's not a one size fits all. So learning about the person and learning what kind of appreciation do they like is a hugely impactful thing for leaders to do. And working hard to build that culture of appreciation is going to be an incredibly powerful thing for you as a leader and for your organization. And then taking responsibility, that is huge. In employee relations, we have a lot of these kinds of conversations. We see a lot of approaches to feedback when we're giving workplace feedback, performance feedback. And one of you guys know, one of our employee relations, who it's our manager, Jim Woodard, and I talk about this quite a bit. And it's kind of what we feel like gives us the best indicator of how things are going to go is in that meeting when we tell someone with their manager, these are some things that we would like to talk to you about that are concerns. However, it's kind of that same thing as like whatever happens next is really, really important and critical for the success of the person. And when we see victimization type language there or defensiveness, we usually are a little bit not hopeful for that situation. We're less hopeful, I should say, because it's really, really hard for people to learn what they need from that, take the responsibility from there, and make the changes to then become successful. When we do see employees who say, and I can't even believe that like this actually happens, but it does. Someone says, thank you for the feedback. I can see your point of view. I have some things that I would like to share also, because we don't want people to just say, well, there's nothing here that this person could change, or there's nothing wrong with this culture. There are things that leaders can learn, but there's also things employees can learn, and we need to be able to have that dialogue. But I want to do what I can do to be successful here. And so I will take this feedback and I will put it to work. And then finally, when we have this self-soothing and we take a break, this physiological self-soothing, and spend that time doing something soothing or distracting, which is different than stonewalling, but that helps our brains to reset, and that helps us to be able to overcome difficult situations and then come back in with that emotional intelligence, that mindfulness, and that ability to really have good reasoning and logic to be able to have good conflict resolution. I think that I'm out of time. It's been a pleasure being with all of you. I'm always happy to help and have further conversations about situations that you might be in where you could use some help. So thank you so much for inviting me. I absolutely love the wellness program, and I really appreciate the wellness team and all they do for the university. So thank you so much.